Hello, and welcome to Supply Chain Next. I'm your host, Richard Donaldson. Join me as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges practitioners face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network. Okay, and welcome to the next episode of Supply Chain Next. I'm Richard Donaldson, and I'm super excited today to have Roberto Reichard on the program. Hey, Roberto.
Hello, Richard. Good to be here.
Great to have you. And this is our, I guess, sort of a milestone, 25th episode. So you are coming in at a cool time, and you also are coming in, I think, with a topic that is so timely around retained carbon, and how that is kind of a piece of the overall kind of circularity, sustainability puzzle, whatever you want to call it. But you've had a fascinating career that we're going to get into, spanning a few decades and a couple big behemoth companies with Bechtel and then all of a sudden BP. And I think it's a very interesting question, because I think you, if I'm going to put it this way, and it's going to launch into the sort of start of your career, but you have an interesting, as an individual, you have an interesting parallel as an individual coming out of your career and then landing and focusing on retained carbon as a piece of sustainability as a reflection of the overall industry, right? Because the industry itself is kind of following what you are doing as an individual to some extent, and I kind of look at your old or new CEO from your former company at BP, Bernard. He's championing the whole conversion of the company from a raw natural resources into a sustainability, energy focused kind of company. So I think it's just a really interesting topic. So let me pause there. We don't want to hear me. I want to talk about you, and kind of just very first question, kind of a little bit of who you are, and tell us about your journey through your career and how you got to where you are.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm an engineer by training. I graduated as an industrial engineer from the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom. And as I was looking for where to get a job, that was sort of priority one after graduation. The industry that actually presented the better opportunities, pay, travel, interesting work, was actually the energy business. So I signed up with a company called Schlumberger. They provide oil field services around the world. And I got the opportunity to work with them in Turkey, in Egypt, in Venezuela. After 5 or 6 years of that, I decided to go back to school, since I was in the oil industry, and get some more grounding in that business. So I took a master's in science from Imperial College in London. And after that, that's where I met my future wife. We decided, why don't we go back to the States for a while? And of course, we chose to go to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, I joined Bechtel in their upstream energy team, and really spent a long time with Bechtel doing large projects, from studies all the way to large projects, and again, all around the world, including Mexico, Thailand, India, Egypt, Turkey again, and a fabulous career, some very large, interesting projects. I was finishing up a project that I was leading for them in India, doing the first deep sea offshore gas development in the Bay of Bengal for a company called Reliance, one of the biggest Indian companies, owned by one of the richest men in the world, and really looking to see what to do next. And I was recruited by BP, and so I thought, well, that'd be a good change. It's always good for one's brain to go learn something new, see an industry from a totally different perspective, right? As opposed to from the contractor side, I was going to go see it from the owner side. But again, so I joined BP's major projects group in 2009. And with them, I went to Alaska. I was a vice president of projects in Alaska. So I never had seen the Arctic, but learned how to do major projects in the Arctic. That's a quite unique and unusual, very modularized environment. As much as possible gets built offsite and then transported up to the Arctic site, either on land or the bigger ones in large barges. I also did some work for BP in the Gulf of Mexico on taking care of some of the projects on the existing platforms. And then I also was a vice president for projects in Southeast Asia. So looking after all our major projects in that region. The biggest one of those was an LNG development in Indonesia, in the island of Papua. Very remote, very socially and environmentally sensitive location. We were developing a train of LNG in really sort of pristine area. Really got me to thinking about what I was doing and the impact that we were having on the local population. And although BP is actually a very sort of sensitive company in that area, very careful on how we do things, it's nevertheless sort of impossible not to have an impact. But we went to the extreme of, for example, although the location is very, very remote, we never built an airport or a road to the location, because we knew that would attract an influx of other people and all the other things that come along with people coming into a sort of a pristine area. So in fact, to get to the area will take a whole day. It will take a plane ride, then another smaller plane ride, and then a couple of hours by boat. But we actually did that on purpose, right? To maintain the remoteness and minimize the impact to the area. BP then asked me to come back to the States and be their vice president of project management for upstream. So essentially project management for all of their major upstream projects. And a major project is anything where BP has an equity of $250 million at least, right? So there were multi-billion-dollar projects. Did that for a couple of years, but was still feeling that really I wasn't having the impact in the world that I wanted to have. And decided that the best thing to do was to step away and see if I can actually use my major project skills in something a little bit more sustainable and greener for the world. So that's where I am now. I've joined Zero Emissions Advisors, a consulting advisory firm in the new energy field, and sort of putting really my energy to bring forth a greener, more sustainable world.
So, again, just an amazing exposure to, what a lot of people in this world just don't even understand is to go from, Schlumberger, I didn't even know that in your CV, to Bechtel, to BP. I mean, these are three of the biggest companies in the world doing the biggest projects. I was going to also ask you, when you're doing major projects at BP, just on average, how many per year were you looking at? Dozens? I mean, it's not trivial, the amount of projects that are going on.
Right. So when you're leading a major project, it's actually, many years per project. Right. Now, in my last role as a vice president in project management, or even my role in Southeast Asia, I had multiple projects going on under me. Right. In Southeast Asia, it was maybe 4 or 5 in the $1 billion sort of range. Not all of which were operated by BP. Some were operated by other companies, but since we were equity partners, we had an oversight role in those. Mm-hmm. Now, in the role as a vice president of global project management, then that was dozens and dozens of projects that we had to oversee. Mm-hmm. Part of what I did in that role is review project readiness to go through to the gate process. So essentially got to see and review and help projects around the world, projects of all sorts, onshore, offshore, Arctic, subsea, etc.
Right. And throughout all of that, and the common theme that seems to come out is this experience you had, on this particular project that you highlighted, where you really began to start to consciously think about the impact on the environment, right? So, on the one hand, we still need energy to run the world. But on the other hand, we're waking up through our own awareness or experience or whatever to, there's got to be a better way to cohabitate, a planet like ours and not be as destructive, as it were. And you already mentioned some things that are really cool about even a project where you consciously chose to make it, inaccessible to everybody else to maintain the environment that you were in. But I was going to ask you, that also happened to coincide about the time that Bernard was coming in at BP, I think, right? So, I mean, you simultaneously and internal to BP are having this sort of, I don't want to call it epiphany, awakening, whatever you want to call this, around, well, is there a better way than just yanking oil or LNG out of the ground? How do we still maintain delivering energy, but not have as much of an impact on the environment in a negative way? So you were having this as an individual. Bernard's coming in as a company because of all the things that they were going through and the industry's going through. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what's, it just seems like there's all of a sudden this consciousness, awareness that was going on, and you were living it, as a part of that. Was it happening just spontaneously? Were other forces, kind of driving you in this direction? Was it 30 years of kind of doing what you did and all of a sudden going, hey, there's got to be a better way to do this? Or what caused that? What was the catalyst behind that, both for yourself and maybe the company and industry as a community or at large?
Well, I joined BP a year before the incident in the Gulf of Mexico, and that was a big, impactful event for the company. A lot of internal examination of what had gone wrong, how could that have happened. Really, a laser-like focus from then on safety and operational readiness, operational safety, process safety, personal safety as well. And thinking about, what sort of company was BP. The company actually became considerably smaller as a result of that, and had to pay or agreed to pay enormous amounts of money to the U.S. government. But really sort of a lot of contemplation within the company about its role in the world. Now that was, in the early teens. There was a new CEO that came in as well as a result of that. First American CEO for BP, and I knew Bernard Looney from those days. At that time, he was a head of drilling, so he's a driller by background. And he was already on the track to be one of the leaders of the company. And when you met him, he stood out as a very thoughtful person, but also with some very modern ideas. I think part of what drove and drives companies like BP to make the change that they now have to make to become more sustainable is the people in the company. People like myself, certainly a lot of the younger people as well, they don't want to put their lives' efforts into something that they don't see as helping others or helping the world, or even worse, right? Making things harder, dirtier for people. So the impetus is really, I think, coming from the people, as well as external factors. Now, more and more, right? Financing institutions, banks, customers are wanting for their suppliers and their investments to be cleaner. Everybody, I think, is recognizing that the world's carbon budget is finite, and that we've taken a very, very significant chunk of it already, and now we have to do something to limit how we use the world's resources.
Fair enough. And that sort of leads right into, let's talk about how you are approaching that. You and I have talked previously about retained carbon as sort of a key element to measure and track. And, that's sort of an emerging potential KPI that will help drive people's awareness and then ultimately, drive people collectively towards sustainable objectives, right, or outcomes. However, we've been talking about sustainability and environmental impact and all that stuff for a while. We had the carbon credits market, and I don't know, that sort of was hot 10, 12 years ago. I don't know if people are still talking about that. Retained carbon is certainly one measure of the impact we have on the environment, right? And avoiding that. But how did you get to where you are now? And then real specifically, how are we making it real now? Because we've had so many conversations about sustainability and everything, that what's making it real now for you, both in your professional practice now that you're doing consulting? Like, how do you make it real for companies versus just, idle chit chat? I mean, like let's make it practical. What really is actually making sense and actually having a direct impact?
Right. Well, let me start by the end. And I think looking at a company's embodied carbon, or the embodied carbon of their products, can be currently a competitive advantage.
Okay.
So let's put that there. But when I was doing projects, we would certainly look at trying to make a project the most energy efficient once it was in operation, right? Because of course that lowers your costs and has all sorts of other benefits. We would always focus on that. How can we consume less fuel or less consumables, or recycle the heat so we don't waste it, et cetera, et cetera. After I left BP and I started reading and really looking around as to where I thought there might be the potential to make an impact, I came across a concept, the concept of embodied or retained carbon, which is essentially the carbon in the materials, the carbon that is consumed or used in the extraction and the manufacture of materials. And that is a significant amount. So for example, in a building, in an office building, up to about 40% of the carbon consumed by that office building in its life cycle is the embodied carbon. So it's a huge number that really wasn't tackled until recently. The movement for embodied carbon began in the civil industry, right? Buildings, infrastructure. They're the people, I think, that started looking at this and have actually pushed that concept forward the most, to the point that is actually, I think, pretty widely used in many locations around the world. And it's becoming a regulatory policy in locations around the world as well. So what I'm trying to look at is, how can we bring the progress that the civil industry, the buildings and infrastructure industry has made, to the rest of the industrial plant of the world, and also working with colleagues who are doing major projects to bring that forth to their thinking when they're thinking of the concept of a project.
Okay.
I think eventually that's going to reflect on the procurement choices that people make, favoring lower embodied carbon products over higher embodied carbon products.
Well, let me double click on that for a second, because I think this is where, you're an expert in the space. So some people who are listening might not understand what the definition of embodied carbon is. So that's one question. But the question I want to ask before that, though, is, of all, I'll call it the natural gases or things to focus on, why carbon versus, say, methane, or why carbon versus, say, I don't know, natural gas depletion or something like that. I mean, I'm trying to think of like, what is it about? Because we all talk about carbon, and I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I don't think people, we've heard it so much, but why that versus something else? Like, what is it about the retained carbon measurement and measuring that allows you to really have an effect positively on sustainability?
So the focus on carbon, I think, is because it's ubiquitous, right? Whereas methane is also a very powerful greenhouse gas, but it's not present in every process.
Fair enough.
Well, carbon pretty much is. But you're right. Carbon is just one of the components of the global warming potential of a particular material or product.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to quantify that global warming potential or your embodied carbon is through a document called an environmental product declaration.
Okay.
Which is a way to actually measure and transparently display what the environmental impact of a particular product is.
Mm-hmm. And so, sorry, I was going to jump in on that one too, because you measure. So let me tie that back to a statement you made earlier. So if I look at a building today as an example, and you make the statement that 40% of the embodied carbon is in the material or something like that. Well, the logical question is, what's the other 60%? Right. And what do we kind of say? What does it mean to be 100%? Like, let's just kind of start, like, help people to understand a little bit of the methodology around the measurements and why these metrics are important. And then how do we reduce them, and what's the direct impact on the environment? I think people would really benefit from that.
So the statement was 40% of the carbon in the life cycle of a building is embodied in the materials.
Mm-hmm.
The other 60%, a lot of it is the operational carbon, what it takes to run the building, the heating, the lights, etc. There's also some carbon release at the end of life.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the whole cycle of a building, from extracting the ore to make the steel, to take the steel to the site, to erect the building, then to operate the building, and eventually somehow come to the end of his life, either dismantle or decommission or whatever. If you look at that whole life cycle, 40% of the carbon is in the extract and make part of the building. Extract the raw materials and make the product. That's 40% of the carbon.
Wow. So
it's huge, it's significant. And you can, right now in the civil industry, they can actually take that amount down by 10, 12% for no cost, just by careful choice of design and choice of materials. Now they're doing that in the building and infrastructure industry, and worldwide emissions, about 39% of those are due to buildings and infrastructure. So it's a huge area that's being tackled. But there's also a huge area that hasn't really caught on to embodied carbon yet, right? And that's the sort of the more industrial area. And I think the next step is not only to look at the embodied carbon of individual materials. So right now in the civil industry, they're looking at embodied carbon in steel or in cement or aluminum. But what about if you look to an industrial plant? What about the carbon that's embodied in a more complex engineered piece of equipment, in a pump or a compressor, which has dozens and dozens of parts sourced from many different places? What is the carbon in that? And you can imagine that's a much harder amount to calculate, because you're sourcing from dozens and dozens of places around the world. And different types of materials combined to make a product. So I think that will be the evolution eventually of this move. But I think first we have to make it more widespread and take it outside the civil industry to other industries.
So how are you doing that now? I mean, that's kind of what you've, in this phase of your career and journey, this is what you're doing. So how are I'm assuming you're kind of going back to Schlumberger and Bechtel, I would sort of put more in the general construction. BP obviously is in the energy sector, but they all work very similar stuff. how are you bringing these concepts back to companies? How are you engaging companies to work with them to start this process and start these programs?
Right. So one thing I'm doing is I'm going back and having conversations with my colleagues at BP, uh, a colleague who was a vice president for project concepts, because that's, at the beginning of a project, when it's still a concept, is where you can have the greatest impact.
Right.
The more it gets defined, the harder it is to
Right.
change the project, and bringing this concern to them, and showing them how they can actually reduce the carbon or the global warming impact of a project just by careful choice of materials and products. And we're having discussions about doing this the way the industry helped suppliers on safety and on quality.
Okay.
Essentially, safety and quality both became key buying factors for contractors or for materials and equipment, to the point that we would select one contractor over the other solely based on their safety performance. We can take a similar approach with the environmental impact of the products that we're buying, right? And it's not a stick approach; it's more of a carrot,
Mm-hmm.
right? And work with the suppliers, like we did in safety. We work with them to improve their safety programs, their safety trainings, their safety culture inside the house. The plan is to do the same with suppliers based on the environmental performance of their products or their services.
Mm-hmm.
And from sort of the owner side, you just make sure that you have a policy that encourages the environmental impact of our product to be one of the key factors in deciding what product you're going to buy or what service you're going to choose. So that's one approach I'm taking to try to bring this idea out of the civil industry and into the rest of the industrial world.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, and like anything else, a lot of this is driven by economics, obviously, right?
Yes.
Profitability, margin, and stuff like that. We're going to come back to that in a second, because so many things are nice to haves, but until it affects the bottom line, you don't see a lot of movement in most enterprise, in most industries for that matter. But where I wanted to go for a second is back to kind of what, again, the experiences that you have and how you're kind of building companies here. But let's talk to the suppliers for a second, because I think that's a fascinating, there's going to be some pressure on suppliers to not only be, ethically, morally sourcing, right? So we're dealing with, in other areas, you don't want to see child labor, being exactly. Exploited. You don't want unethical business practices and the people that you're working with, i.e. their corrupt bribery, whatever, trading with bad partners. But then we get into sustainability. So how would you speak to suppliers in starting their own? Like, how do you even begin to, I want to work with BP, I want to work with Chevron, I'm a new supplier, I want to get qualified. There's this new qualification that's coming up, besides my financial health, besides my, legal and delivery schedule health and whatever. It's this sort of sustainability health. Like, how do you get them started on that? How do you advise these suppliers to even begin that, to start to work with a BP or a Chevron or something like that?
Right. Well, the idea is that you want your suppliers to have the same or a common ethos. Mm-hmm. You want to be working with companies that share your perspective as much as possible, and you want to help them get to that point where they actually share your perspective. So I think there has to be customer pull. So for a customer like BP or any customer, on average, the emissions of the upstream supply chain, right, of all its suppliers, can be, on the average, I think, is 5.5 to 6 times the company's own emissions, right? So those are called the Scope 3 emissions, right? Those Scope 3 emissions are a rich area for becoming more sustainable.
Mhm.
If you can influence something that is 5 or 6 times the size of your pot, obviously, that's a very good target. You have to show the suppliers that having products that are have low global warming potential, low embodied carbon, is a competitive advantage. So they will see that they will be selected because of that. But also, to get to the point where they can show you what their global warming potential is, or the embodied carbon of the product, they have to do some work. They have to try to analyze what it is, right, and figure it out. In doing that work, they will actually see inefficiencies in their process and areas where they can actually improve and become greener at the same time, because they will be forced to analyze their own supply chain,
Mhm.
right? And find the areas where they're, so that also is an incentive for them. And of course, I think suppliers will also be subject to the same pressures as somebody like BP is. Their employees are also going to want to be good world citizens and want to work for a company that is doing its bit to help lower our emissions, for example.
Mhm.
I think those same pressures that work on the client company will work on the supplier company. And then of course, the client company, the buyer, has the ability to incentivize a supplier,
Mhm.
right? And potentially provide premiums for lower impact products, or even fund some programs within the supplier to have them improve their sustainability performance. In the oil and gas industry, we did that with some of our contractors to help them improve their safety performance or their
Mhm.
quality performance, right?
Mhm.
So I think there are tools and it can be done, and I think it's a matter of time just before this gets widespread.
Well, let me ask because number of different things in there. However, three of four of those are a little bit more qualitative, which is totally fine, right? Which is, you want to kind of line yourself up as a buyer. You're going to line yourself up with people who are kind of psychologically in the same mindset, right? So that's sort of a
Same
qualitative.
values.
Yeah. But fair, absolutely. And then you get to, a little bit, the company has to change within, and they might, but where I think things start to get a little bit more, I don't want to say compelling, but economically compelling, since that's usually what drives a lot of people, is that you have the chance to win more business, right? That seems to me where the quantitative value can be expressed. That, and I'm just using BP as examples when we're talking about it. BP purchased, I'm just making numbers up based on industry, $200 billion worth of stuff last year, right? Of that 200 billion, 2%, were from, or 5%, 10%, 20% kind of came from low sustained or retained carbon, kind of manufacturers or suppliers. And we're going to 30%, or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a means with the buyers to start publishing data in a more transparent way, like give the suppliers even more economic incentive to make these choices that, oftentimes cost them a little bit extra money right in the short term, but in the long term, to your point, are going to pay off huge dividends. But they need to see that numerically. I mean, we're to put my cynic hat on, businesses don't move very quickly unless there's a dollar figure sitting in front of them.
Yeah. Or a regulation.
Well, true. Okay, fair, right. That's
So
yeah.
So when you're looking at a supplier or a contractor for a project, you can incentivize them. Well, if you're a private company, you don't have to buy the lowest cost.
Right.
Right. If you're, a government entity doing public procurement, you probably do. But if you're a private company, you don't necessarily have to buy the lowest cost. So you evaluate the products, the contractors on other issues, and you tell them upfront what the evaluation criteria is. So for example, we used to weight safety very, very heavily. Their safety
Sure.
performance, their safety
Sure.
record, their
Sure.
quality performance. They had to be certified, ISO 9000 certified or whatever, that sort of thing. So that's the way you incentivize it, and you make it part of the bottom line. You may be the low cost supplier, but if you're getting there because of child labor or because you're burning coal with no compunction, well,
Mhm.
we probably won't select you,
Right.
for example. Now, the issue is currently suppliers don't know what their impact is
Yes.
because they haven't been asked to measure it, right? So that's the first step, right? We have to help them get to the point where they can measure and develop what I mentioned before, these environmental product declarations for their product that really set
Mhm.
out the impact of each material or product. So I think that's one way. And of course, the other way is policy. So more and more uh, authorities in different countries and different states are now making the carbon impact of a product a key buying choice decision. Uh, for example, here in Marin, where I'm living at the moment, in Marin, California, there's now a requirement for the embodied carbon of cement for
Okay.
buildings, for commercial buildings or buildings of a certain size. The General Services Administration in California has also now come up with requirements for embodied carbon for steel. Right? They will become effective pretty soon. In European countries, Finland, for example, there's also now policy requirements. In Canada, right, cities like Vancouver,
Mhm.
they have policies and regulations now that will drive suppliers to take a look at what their products are and see how they can make them cleaner to meet the regulatory policies. So that's the other way to drive the industry. It's probably not the preferred, not the most efficient. Obviously, in our capitalist system, I think money talks, but with regulation or actually protections
Mhm.
rather than regulations, it's a way of making public money talk.
Sure. Sure. Well, let me dive into that for a second too. So, and you mentioned Marin, and now as a supplier, I'll just take the example of cement. I'm a cement manufacturer.
Yeah.
I want to participate in the upcoming build out of the Marin City Hall, whatever.
Right.
And Marin says, okay, well, we need to see what your retained carbon calculations are for your cement.
Right.
How do they start? How do they provide that number? Is there a framework? Is there a consultancy? Is that something you do? What's the ISO certification for my retained carbon calculation?
Right. So there are various international bodies that would certify your calculations. You start with this environmental product declaration, which is a pamphlet 4 or 5 pages long that gives all the details of your product, how it's manufactured, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to do that, and that's a process. And there's a framework laid out as to how you do it and what you include and what you don't include for a particular product. You can hire a consultancy to do that for you. It'll cost $10,000 to $30,000 per product, or you can learn how to do that in-house, right? And do that in-house. Once you have that essentially you end up with these EDPs that are certified by a third party saying, yeah, that is correct. That's the environmental impact of this particular product. And that's what the regulators call for. What they've done, like in California, they've taken an average of for steel, for example, they've taken an average of the carbon impact of the current set of products out there, and then said that, okay, you have so right now at the moment it's relatively simple. They've made the rule the current average.
Okay.
And periodically, every few years, they're going to be lowering that carbon impact average down to make sure that the products that they're buying are increasingly more and more sustainable.
Gotcha. And is that So, okay, perfect. So there's, there is a framework, right? So, and the reason I'm asking these questions too is, there's a lot of suppliers that tune into these things, and, there isn't a step-by-step guide. Is that pamphlet in that framework? Is that like a UN originated kind of thing, or is there a separate international organization that's known for carbon calculations?
There are many consultancies and groups that
Right.
do this. There are international bodies that that have set out what the standard is to do this. There's an
Okay.
ISO standard, International Standards Organization standards. There's a European standard, which is obviously very similar to the ISO.
Right.
And as I say, there are consultancies that will do this.
Okay.
Right. And then there, as part of the EDP, there's a life cycle assessment, right? That then looks at the embodied carbon of the whole life cycle of the product through reuse. And there's also methodologies that do that. The University of Washington has a free tool. It's called the Ec3 Calculator.
Okay.
And they have a free database. So if you're a designer, you can actually go to their database and see the environmental product declarations of thousands of building products.
Oh, cool.
And make a choice based on that. So databases exist for the environmental product declarations, and free tools exist to actually do the life cycle assessment of your.
So I'm going to be a little geeked out because my head starts to get geeky pretty quick. It's often happened when you start saying that. So if I were to do a query on this database, with the query of, I'm looking for cement suppliers who do X when it comes to retained carbon, what is that I'm querying? Is it I hit a certain threshold, or the retained carbon is 10%? I mean, how do you frame that query?
It's largely a comparison. So if you're a designer and you need cement with certain specs, certain compressive strength or composition or whatever, you first sort by that.
Sure.
Right? And then you'll get a list of the products that meet your specification, and within that list you'll be able to evaluate their embodied carbon, right. So you can choose to make your procurement choice based on that.
And would that embodied carbon represent? Would that be a number? I guess I just have never seen it, so I don't know. Is it like
it's a number of a CO2 equivalent per unit.
Got it.
And the unit is either kilograms or cubic meters, right? Depending on what you're looking at.
Got it. I see. Okay, cool. So now let's, we've gotten into the weeds and the details. Yeah. Now let's flip back to sort of where you are now looking forward. How are you specifically kind of, tuning what you do in your consulting practice to help companies make this move? And then secondly, how do you see this playing out over the next 3, 4, 5 years, right? I mean, it sounds like, and I tend to agree, that this is going to become just sort of part and parcel of how you buy stuff, right? It's going to become more transparent around the retained carbon calculations in suppliers and even the owner operators of what they're doing. Like that's going to become, and I'll give you an example. In my former life, when I was doing data centers, we had a metric called PUE, or power utilization effectiveness, right? It's a industry now recognized KPI, but we invented that at the time. Like there was no, miles per gallon for data centers. That became the standard. That all of a sudden drove more efficiency. Once that became, people started then comparing PUEs against each other. Right. And that's what started, that competition started driving more and more efficiency in, right? And I would assume it's like miles per gallon or, once there's a number and people can kind of latch onto that, then you start to see a pretty big hockey stick effect, right? So looking forward, is that something you see coming? Do you know what that is? How does this play out the next 3-5 years?
Well, I think the same way that probably happened in the data industry, it becomes a customer pull. Right. You probably didn't have a policy requirement in that industry, but it's also going to become a regulatory requirement. Yep. So you're going to have to meet the minimum threshold of whatever the regulation is before you can supply to, I guess, public projects. Mm-hmm. Eventually, that regulation may encompass all projects. Who knows? And then there's competition is going to drive you to try to be able to tell your buyers, look, we're the greenest supplier of cement or this particular material, and we can do it at the same or lower price of our competition, or maybe it's only a little bit more, and the buyer is cool with paying the premium.
Right.
And more as companies realize that their emissions, their upstream of their supply chain, are 5 to 6 times the size of their own emissions, they're going to focus on that area, as we discussed earlier. So I think there's going to be both a pull from the buyers and a growing regulatory requirement to meet these minimums.
Well, the one thing I would say, having gone through the other side of this, is one of the reasons as an industry we decided to create PUE and drive that, right, is we wanted to stay ahead of regulation, right? So our own internal conversation was, if regulation comes in, then we're subject to people who aren't even from the industry creating, numbers and objectives that don't make sense, right? So we sort of try to stay ahead of it. Now, I'm going to come back from switch topics a little bit here, but another example in the outside world that I think you may see more of, and I don't know if you've seen this yet, but John, the CEO of Nike, a guy named John Donahoe, used to be the CEO at eBay and did an interim step at a company called ServiceNow. But interesting, he's running Nike because that really, a couple things in there. One, you got a technology guy who's kind of transforming a retail, sportswear company into more of a technology company. But he just announced the other day that part of his executive compensation packages for all executives is going to be something affiliated with sustainability. I don't know what that is, but right there, boom, now you got the C-suite all financially incented to achieve sustainable metrics. I think that's going to start having a huge impact on this thing taking shape, right, in the world, that this be making it more real. Are you seeing other things like that? I mean, regulation, obviously, but more specific things within companies that are happening now that you see triggering this to be more front and center.
Yeah, I think that's more and more widespread for senior executives and to be rewarded partly on sustainability targets, on emission targets. Even when I was in BP, we had goals around methane emissions and reductions, year-on-year reductions in methane emissions that impacted our annual performance and reward. So that's been, I think, growing now for several years, and it's becoming more and more and more. And then again, from the other side, financial institutions are going to be incentivizing that as well, through where they make their investments, who they approve for loans, et cetera, right? So I think it'll be coming from all sides, really. I think it's inevitable.
What about, and let me get in, we got a few minutes left, so I want to be conscious of time, but kind of, getting into a little bit of the prognostic side of things, right? Like, what do you see? There's the concept, but are there technologies, or, I mean, again, philosophies, of course, are changing. People's attitudes are changing. Education is also kind of bringing awareness to this whole thing. Like you said, the younger generation has been taught, from sort of the cradle to really think more environmentally, and they're making buying decisions based on that. They make decisions based on where they work, on what the kind of internal ethos is of these companies. Are they doing the right thing for the right people? What other things are you seeing that are kind of triggering more? I mean, and there's the obvious, which is just the aggregate number of human beings is growing at a rate that, it's pretty massive. We have to do something to really address this, right? But what in the space of technology, anything from the technological point of view or other, that is really going to, have some pretty profound effects over the next 3 to 4 to 5 years that you see coming?
Well, if you look at Bill Gates' new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, I guess one of the things he points out is that things like wind and solar energy are already very competitive with fossil fuels, or a lot of times even more cost effective.
Sure.
However, there are a lot of major industrial processes that are not yet competitive as a green process.
Mhm.
And that we actually, the technology should be focused on what he calls the green premium. How much more do we pay for something that is made cleanly versus something that is made without any concern about the externalities that it causes, right? The emissions, environmental impacts, etc.
Mhm.
So I think technology is rightly going to be focused on that.
Okay.
How do we make steel made with hydrogen as competitive as steel made with fossil fuel energy? So I think that's an area to really watch, right?
Mhm.
All these startups, companies, technologies that are addressing this green premium.
Mhm.
And then I think not so much a technology, but something we've talked about, right? Is we're going to move to a more circular economy as well, right? Which I know is one of the areas that interests you.
Mhm.
We're going to get away from this, take, make, waste, linear process to a cycle of reduce, reuse, recycle, etc., repair,
Sure.
recycle.
Sure.
So I think that's more of a philosophical innovation, but I think that's something that is also going to hit us like a big wave in the future.
Well, so that's interesting. So on that point, have you spent time, and again, kind of looking forward a little bit in the recycling area, in the retained carbon calculations in the recycling process, right? I mean, is it sort of a zero sum gain or is it a net positive? I mean, I'm assuming it's a net positive, but I actually don't even know.
Yeah, when you do the life cycle assessment for your product, and if at the end of the life cycle the product gets reused, recycled, you get credits in
I
your
see.
life cycle assessment. You get carbon credits
I
for
see.
that.
Yep.
Right. So obviously products that can be recycled or reused have some can't, right? It's pretty tough to do with some other products, but the majority of them can, and you do get a credit on the assessment.
What about like metals though? The one thing I was thinking of, because I had an interesting conversation a while ago at the CSCMP conference with a guy who operated one of the handful of smelters in the United States, and he was recycling copper, let's say, right?
Yeah.
And what fascinated me, what seems obvious, is the output of that recycled copper was metallurgically this exact same as copper pulled out of the ground, because it has to be. The standards dictate it has to be, right? So there's no difference. I mean, from a qualitative point of view, there's zero difference between copper out of the ground versus copper that's been recycled. So the question is, I never thought to think about in recycling copper, how do you compare that retained carbon of the recycled material versus the material I'm pulling out of the ground? Because there's still a lot of energy to recycle copper. I just don't know if it's a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 gain with recycling metal as an example versus pulling it out of the ground.
Yeah. So copper is one of these metals that is infinitely recyclable. You can
Right.
do it many times, and it's still copper doesn't lose its properties. And if you look at the environmental product declaration of that sort of copper, for example, it will be lower than copper that is or a copper product that is made from freshly mined, freshly extracted copper, because you're not using that whole carbon budget of mining the stuff and transporting it to the refinery where it gets turned into copper. All that is out of the equation.
Right.
So for example, also steel made with recycled iron is also lower emissions than virgin steel. So that in itself will also be driving this move towards the circular economy, right?
Well, absolutely, because I was talking to this guy that it was fascinating because it wasn't, and here's the irony of it all. It wasn't that he had a problem selling his recycled copper. He didn't have enough throughput to meet the demands of the people that needed it. So I was scratching my head going, well, wait a minute. So you're telling me you sell copper that's equivalent to what you call virgin copper. It ends up being a little bit cheaper, is surely way more sustainable, but the only reason you can't sell more of it is you can't produce it fast enough.
And I think it's the
Which
same
is crazy.
It's the same in the steel industry as well, right? The steel made out of recycled materials is only 15-20% of the total steel market.
Right.
And we have to improve that. Right?
Yeah, which is like, that just seems like an obvious one to me. It's like, well, how do we raise awareness around these recyclers so that people actually can go to them, so we can get more guaranteed throughput, right? Because it's about flow. All right, I definitely would have been conscious of time because I know coming up in here. So any last thoughts or just, I mean, it's been a great conversation, but what do you got going on for yourself or your consultancy or anything, or just any kind of parting thoughts on what's going on in the world of sustainability, retained carbon?
Yeah, well, in my consultancy, Zero Emission Advisors, we look at actually emissions generally. We're technology agnostic. So, whether you want to take energy from wind or solar or hydrogen, we do have a particular expertise, some of my colleagues in hydrogen. Mm-hmm. But I think the parting thoughts are one of the big questions is how and where are we going to find the right use for hydrogen? Because we know it's very clean, but it has some significant disadvantages for things like mobility. It has some advantages in terms of energy storage, right? But I don't know if you follow the conversation now. Hydrogen is having a moment,
right?
But it's not clear really whether that moment is real, because I don't think we have yet found the right niche, and I think it will be a niche for the hydrogen. So I think this conversation about the hydrogen economy is a lot yet to be sort of landed. So
gotcha. Well, that's a good one. No, I think there's we're definitely making some big shifts right now. God only knows what we're going to find when we start mining some of these asteroids, now that they're pulling, literally, pulling materials off of these space rocks, who knows what we're going to find that's infinitely more renewable or cause more problems, who knows. But anyways, I want to thank you. It's just been a fascinating conversation, really just a wonderful conversation around, retained carbon, kind of where it's going. And you've got such an interesting view coming out of an industry that is itself transforming. Just a lot of fun. Thank you.
Right. Great.
This is Richard Donaldson. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about the episode or topics in supply chain you'd like us to explore, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at supplychainnext@requis.com. And while you're at it, why not check out the Requis platform at supplychain.requis.com. Requis allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud, collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at www.requis.com.